And then, yeah, let's get started. So I'd like to introduce you to three of the people that are going to be most essential in this call. The first one is Cassidy. Cassidy's going to be moderating our discussion today and also just giving you a quick intro to the call and why we're doing it. Cassidy, if you just want to say hi quick.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Cool. And then also Simon de la Rouviere, I'm sure most of you already know, and Paul Kohlhaas, who will also be presenting today. And my name is Devin. So I just set up the first call, and it's really cool to meet most of you guys. And I'm sure we'll chat a little bit more, I think, in the discussion part of the section of the call. Really cool that so many of you guys responded. And like I said, this is still kind of a first round of this call, very experimental in that sense. And I'd be more than happy to take a bunch of your guys' suggestions for future calls moving forward. So yeah, Cassie.
Cool. So I'd just like to welcome everyone to the call. And maybe to start, pose a question, why do we actually care about curation markets? And what do they really hope to accomplish? So I guess at their core, the way I see them is enabling coordinated collaboration. So what I mean by that is really the ability to earn value from what we co-create and utilizing collective knowledge and resources of the commons in an effective way. So some subsets include TCRs and curve bonding, and their uses can range everything from meme spotting to funding cutting-edge pharmaceutical research, which Paul is working on with Molecule. I think curation markets were presented as an early concept in 2016, but they really started gaining traction last year in 2017 among researchers, token engineers, and developers. And the curation market Skitter, started by Simon, is an open source online platform to connect and to discuss. But this call was really set up to take that to the next step and build up the curation markets community. So the goal here is really to enable faster growth of new concepts that are coming out through collaboration. So it's really a community-initiated effort that's really aimed to bring together a broader global group. So, I'm dialing in from the west coast of the US right now. I think some of you guys are in Europe. So it's really trying to bring us all together in an independent setting. So just to reiterate what you said before, this workshop is really intended for constructive discussions around curation markets in an approachable setting. So each call will include presentations by experts in the field to really foster a roundtable type of discussion that pushes forward positive developments within the technology. So content might range from projects that use curation markets to just design mechanisms themselves, and actually anything that you would like to discuss in future calls. So today I'd like to introduce our presenters again, Simon and Paul. And then after the presentations, we will open up the floor to questions, discussions, and even your suggestions on future workshops. And we aim to wrap up around the 1 hour mark, but for anyone who wants to stay on longer, it sounds like maybe that would be open to anyone who wants to. So I just ask that you please be respectful to everyone else on the call and keeping this a constructive atmosphere for the discussion. And if you have any questions or comments, or you want to get involved in future workshops, as Devin said, please get in touch with her directly. And I think you have her email, but just in case, it's devin@molecule.co. And thank you all for joining. And I'll go ahead and pass the floor to you, Simon.
Awesome. Thank you, Cassidy. Can everyone hear me? Just need to make sure. Yeah, it seems it should be fine. Thank you for that. And thanks for putting this together. I think it's great that we also experiment and with different platforms for discussion and sharing information and ideas. So thank you for that. Cool. So as far as I understand it, I have about 15 minutes to present some things and then leave it open for questions. I think it might be more interesting given that there will probably be more questions that I'll probably err on the side of being shorter with the presentation. So what I thought I'd talk about is just, I recently wrote an article that gave some more history or perspective on how I came up with some of these ideas around curation markets, to give you sort of just perspective on how the timeline changed and how, given that it's now November 2018, there's still a lot to do. And like the kind of things I've been thinking about, I'm just sharing it with the group. And when I'm thinking about meeting, there's probably a handful of blog posts waiting to be written about some of these ideas. And, a lot of this also comes from having discussions with a lot of you in the community. So if that sounds good, then I'll start off with that. So yeah, the title of what I just want to present, I don't actually have slides or anything, so just riffing on it. But the goal is to say, like, what's the past and future of curation markets? And I think we've learned a lot in 2018 already about people that started implementing them, that's giving useful feedback on how we can move forward and working with these ideas. So for me personally, I started down this path in 2014 when I was working in the space in Bitcoin, and back then it was just Bitcoin. And my goal, or something that I saw that happened, was when Dogecoin came out. And for many, it just seemed as a meme currency or a joke. It had a profound impact on me, both in terms of wanting to get involved in the space on a more permanent level, but also a profound impact in what it felt it meant. For many, it just looked like a joke, but for me, it had more meaning than that. Even today, it is something that works just based on the fact that the currency has value based on the mimetic value of it. So there was no technical innovation there. It was just, let's copy Bitcoin and put a funny dog on it, right? And what it meant to me was that there was now a community that came about that could only work together with each other based on a shared goal of participating in this community. If you had Dogecoin, you could say, I am also involved in this experiment, this funny experiment. And the fact that I even managed to get money and support getting a bobsled team to go to the Winter Olympics and getting a NASCAR car sponsored with a new wrap. I mean, that was phenomenal to see. And it just showed me that the potential was there, that having decreased the barrier to entry to create new currencies, we can actually enable people to coordinate in new ways. So that's where it started. And then it became a several year long rabbit hole of experimenting both technically and philosophically with these principles. How do we recreate Dogecoin, but make it easier for many more things besides just Dogecoin? And so over that time period, I started working on some of these ideas, from doing crazy things like trying to do donation mining in Bitcoin, and it was absurd. Nothing was available technically to support any of these ideas. And then working, when Ethereum came along, working with consensus and started working on ERC20 standard to get tokens to exist as a thing in the first place, to continue thinking about these ideas. A pivotal moment for me was that there was a period when I was speaking to two people in particular, Maciej Opinski and Meher Roy, who also started thinking about some of these ideas in terms of mimetic value of currencies and how they could influence and impact the sort of communities. And essentially it was called the attention economy. And I think that is still relevant for certain people to call it that. So what happened was, I was busy doing research in information overload, because that's what my master's degree was about. And I realized I could actually combine some of these ideas together, which is, how do we enable a community such that there's novel information being produced over sustained periods of time, but then there's also a token that represents the network of value that this community represents. And that's where the sort of initial idea started towards curation markets. Initially, it was just called, there was no names for this stuff. And it was even to say that the current names work as well. Like we're still in the process of figuring out what names work and what doesn't. And initially it was just, I called it hashtag markets, because I thought that people could congregate around the ideas, like hashtags manage to congregate ideas together. You see it particularly in different movements just starting from a hashtag. And this is stuff that weren't possible, we haven't seen before. So just there's an idea, and it's encapsulated through just one word, and we could build organizations around it and movements, for that matter, around it. But the technical components of that stage wasn't very fleshed out. It was just very more simple. I had some principles of there being a continuous token model, but it wasn't fully fleshed out. Then I iterated on an idea trying to make the continuous token model sufficient. And that's when I said, let's change the name, because hashtag markets are a bit vague. Let's call it meme markets. And that turned out to also be a bad idea, because people just thought it was about dank internet memes and not actually the original definition of the word, which is just a cultural unit of information. And I got further with that and got a lot of good feedback from people that read the white paper and gave feedback. And the principle was that you would be able to create a token automatically based on a price curve, but the price would only be reduced once the token was used for something. So you would essentially dispense a coupon in the service in order to produce value. And when the value was produced, the price would decrease so that more people can then buy in and produce value. And then thinking about some of these ideas, a big issue with that was like, what happens with the money that people pay to buy these tokens? And for a long time, it was just like, we should figure out how to distribute it to people that matter to this interest group. Like if it's Dogecoin, the money should go towards the developers or the people that manage this community to make it flourish. But then I thought about a version which is just all the money should be kept in a pot, and you could take the money that was in the pot out, and that's where the bonding curve started, and it was called the bonded curation community. And then that made the most sense to me, and that was like the beginning of my sort of genesis of the idea of bonding curves. And then in last year, May, I decided this felt great. This was another great iteration. Let's not call it meme markets, because people mistook the premise of the idea, and this is called curation markets, because that was always been the premise. Adding tokenized signals of value would increase novelty of information. If you increase novelty of information in a sufficient way, it would improve people's ability to coordinate around various things. And this was especially the belief that it would be useful in larger amorphous groups with a lot of weak ties, like something like a Dogecoin community, right? There are some people you know, but not really know, but it's just people congregating together based on their pure self-interest, but it was also about participating in a collective goal or collective community. So that's where like curation markets started. And since then, bonding curves itself became also sort of separated from the design as something that stands on its own, that could be used in different ways, not just about curation of information. So it's different ways of thinking funding, different ways to put value where your mouth is, different staking models, different bonding, and so forth. So that was like the history to where it lends itself now. And I think what's been interesting in the past year is to see that a lot of people have adopted some of these ideas in different domains. It's been very exciting to see. I don't think we've seen much of it go fully live yet, except it's live in some circumstances. Like proof of weekends is a curve bonding mechanism, but it works for that use case. But for the purpose of curating information, I don't think we've necessarily seen that substantially used in broad application. So that's still some stuff I want to see. But PCRs have been live for since the beginning of the year, and it's been used by Foam and AdChain and others, and we've seen how people use it. So something from that I've been looking at, and something I've been thinking about currently, is that for me still, I think I see a lot of curation market ideas that seem almost a bit too complex for the problems they want to solve at a smaller scale, but which could be useful at the larger scale, right? Once things are thriving, then it works, but it's not necessarily necessary in smaller scales. But the problem is, how do you leap from a smaller scale where you don't necessarily need this to a larger scale where it's needed? And that's been something I've been thinking about a lot. Essentially, how do you scale trust? How do you scale these systems where it becomes valuable? So it is basically two variations that I've been thinking about recently, which is to accept that in some circumstances, the value of these coordination systems are valuable. It's not necessarily valuable when you want to self-organize, because we can sufficiently self-organize in smaller groups, but it becomes hard to self-organize in larger groups. So the way these groups would be able to utilize some of these systems is to say, at 150 members in this group, there now is a constitution that kicks in, a wet code constitution that kicks in and says, we're now upgrading the social contract to move to a curation market that helps us work together beyond this level of self-organization. The other version is that I feel that perhaps what might be more interesting in the short term is to move away from these ideas being rules of the game, but rather ancillary systems, which helps us understand and curate information, but still have the social sort of slow but not economic center, if that makes sense. So a good example of this is you have a weekly newsletter. Instead of the weekly newsletter just being a curation market, it is about, the curation market would be about giving recommendations to the newsletter, and there would still be a person at the end of it that goes, that's a good link for this newsletter, that's a bad link for this newsletter. So it's the premise that it's about recommendations, not about rules. Using curation markets to give good recommendations, not using the curation market to be the rule. Because I think we still need to figure out to some extent whether some of these coordination systems are useful at different scales. So if it's just about recommendations first, and there's still like the sort of wet code, meet space, social institutions in the middle, we could still use both at the same time, figure out where they are valuable before making a curation market the rule of law in terms of how we coordinate. So that's where I am at this moment. I think that's some interesting things I want to talk about more and share in the coming weeks and months. Also, certain ideas around reputation. I think I spoke to some of you at DEF CON about it, but still thinking about it. So there's always a lot to think about, and people come from different domains, disciplines to talk about it. So I think that's my gist of what I want to cover. So I think we have time for a few questions. I think Cassidy or Devin is the timekeeper on that. So I'm not sure exactly how the process will work from here, so feel free to share.
Cool. Yeah, so we do have some time for questions before the next presentation. If you guys do have any questions, you're welcome to either drop them into the chat message thing here. So Simon, there's one already that says, is Reddit a curation market? From Chris.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's sort of, I think, words matter and how we phrase and name things. And if you think about it, we can say like everything is a curation market because we have limited attention. So everything is trying to get our attention. But in this context of this call, like I would say yes and no. There are ways in which it forms a market and an economy based on its algorithms, things like that, but it's not necessarily specifically related to tokenization and creating value. So, I mean, the Dogecoin coin plus its Reddit actually co-created value together. Like if the subreddit didn't exist, Dogecoin wouldn't be where it is. So in that sense, it will actually work together. So yeah, I would say in some sense it is. Other questions? The question
have you got the chat open, Simon? There's one from Mike and there's one from Ryan.
Yeah. So the question about incentivization without tokens using bonding curves. A bit hard to understand a question because bonding curves is about creating tokens. But perhaps more interesting is that I think if we can properly sort of capture aspects of reputation, then we can coordinate without requiring something else to represent some form of options or optionality. It's sort of the case of like if you know the band and going to a gig, then you don't have to pay a ticket to get in, right? But how do you make that into a protocol? That's, I think, a harder question to solve. Next question from Ryan. How much focus on getting curation markets to the next step should be on building schematic and simulation tools, and what can we do to accelerate them? I think it's valuable that we have simulation tools and figuring out what happens at like edge cases and figuring out, or in the good cases, what happens with these systems. And it's valuable that we simulate them with various theoretical ideas and principles. I think now, though, at the earlier stages, I think it just matters more that these things exist and that it's put into the hands of people. And get sort of more qualitative feedback, because things like user experience is incredibly important for these two things to work well, because people need to be able to understand how this economic system works with very little or very low lift in that sense. So I think it's important, but I think it's more important that we just put this stuff out there and see how people respond and interact with it. Question from Luke: do bonding curves incentivize anything other than speculation? It's a good question. I think it's, you do want some sense of speculation because you do want the market to figure out pricing, but you don't necessarily want that be the only thing that matters. So you do want some people with self-interest in making money to participate because they provide liquidity to it. So if you now have liquidity to information, you have people that have a skin in the game to make sure that certain information is more valuable than others. So I think it's a necessary component, but we can probably work on making sure that there aren't the core reason why it exists. It just needs some value signal needs to be there. Then a question from Akil. In your regional token design, the token is used for voting. How do you feel about bonding curves and mint utility tokens that can be redeemed for a certain good or service? I think it's particularly useful if it's used for a specific good or service. Because in that sense, it's just the bonding curve just becomes a way to measure market demand for the service or good. So let's say the service is access to media, right? Specific media. You need the token to access the song, one token to listen to the song, for example. Then the price would fluctuate based on the aggregate market demand to listen to that music. So it is a sort of an automatic way to price the music, not based on individual differences or individual price discrimination, but on aggregate demand, which I think is an interesting aspect of sort of emergent outcome of curve bonding designs. Then from Jeff, I'm not sure how many questions we have, but I'll continue. Just Devin, let me know if one or two more questions there. So I'll take the two questions from Jeff and Atish. Jeff asked, does speculation provide useful value signals in incentivizing quality information aggregation? That is probably a better way to phrase it. Perhaps the original question does incentivize quality information. And I think the jury is still out because it might just be that it incentivizes viral information rather than actually quality information. So that, I think that's still uncertain. And I think that is probably one of my concerns with some of these ideas, is that it ends up just producing the value accrues to things that is not necessarily globally optimal for society. It's just the things that accrue the most value is just Doge. Like, I mean, Dogecoin's good, but like, if you would say money should gravitate to something, should we say it should gravitate to Doge as a meme? So I'm not sure if it actually incentivizes quality information, but I'm certain that we can like design variations that would at least incentivize quality rather than just virality. But I'm hopeful. But I think we need to see what happens in practice. We'll see. That will be interesting. Perhaps a good blog post in itself. Then from Atish, how would prediction markets differ from curation markets? In the former, it seems like the value of information is signaled based on the volume of bids, skin in the game. I would say prediction markets is actually very similar in some sense, because the fact that a prediction market exists incentivizes people to produce information for it, right? So if you create a prediction market that says who's like should like in a futarchy, like should the company make this decision or not, by the fact that there's value involved means that the people that think they know the right answer will then be attracted to buy into the prediction market to help facilitate the information signal. So I do think in some sense it is somewhat like it's like a weak curation market in some sense. I also, it is still sort of, yes, I would probably say it's like a weak curation market in that sense. But, you know, I think you would probably be able to build a curation market or like curation ranking or information aggregation system on prediction markets. And I think Vitalik once proposed some of the ideas around that, using prediction markets for information curation. It just feels like it's a more clunkier system than something more specific, like just attaching specific monetary value to information. And yeah, as Logan said, that's a good way to put it. Prediction markets do eventually settle. There has to be specific outcome or novelty to be produced with prediction markets, whereas curation markets is continuously liquid. So that is also one of the difference. But it's very good questions. It's very good food for thought, definitely. Awesome. So I think that ends my part of the presentation. Thank you for listening, and I hope that was a useful context for the past and some interesting ideas for the future, and some interesting discussions for the future. I think we're still at day one in many regards, so everyone here in this call have a lot to contribute still, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. So our next speaker coming up is Paul, and Paul will be talking about funding curve design and funding models. So this topic was mainly based on a lot of your guys' recommendations, either via the Google form or on the Gitter. And if that works out as well, for the future, we'll use the same model for voting on topics and speakers. So Paul, the floor is yours.
Cool, thanks everyone. And thanks for that nice history, Simon. It's really good actually looking back onto the roots of how this has all evolved. And yeah, I remember talking with you about like hashtag markets first in like, I think like late 16. So it's really, really cool to see how far this whole topic space has come. And maybe just for me, some context setting as well. I think these calls are really, really cool. Like what I kind of realized was that like I did a few workshops and like around bonding curves and curation markets, and started realizing that like this back and forth feedback is really, really valuable in building up the space. More so like, and sometimes it can be more effective than like the analog feedback that we find on things like Telegram groups and so on and so forth. So I think that's kind of like, that's an idea as well. And I hope as kind of this space grows as well, we can have more and more of like casual conversations where you can all just kind of jump in and we can throw ideas around and like brainstorm. It's like hive mind thinking. Cool. So I want to quickly just give you guys maybe some background. The project that I'm working on is called Molecule. And so we are kind of using curation markets with the aim of curating valuable pharmaceutical IP. And so recently I've been doing a lot of and I'll set a little bit of context, but I've been doing a lot of design thinking around what are the actual different parameters within bonding curves that we can adjust to achieve different goals that the curve actually has. And in doing that, I realized that I feel bonding curves, so bonding curves for me are a subset of curation market. And talking to more and more people over the past recent months, I've realized that often people confuse TCRs and curation markets and bonding curves. Like often someone will be like, oh, you're using a bonding curve, that's a TCR. And I'm like, no, this is completely different. Or mixing up the term TCR with bonding curves in general. So, and the more and more I think about bonding curves, the more I think that they are like, to think of them like really as a price discovery mechanism for any type of asset and kind of an automated market maker, which if you think about it is a completely new concept, which is why I find it so fascinating, is like for any given asset that you want to trade, you normally need you have an order book, and an order book is made out of buy and sell orders, which are normally placed, they can be placed by bots, but the bots are controlled by humans. In a bonding curve, the price itself, the market making happens through the bonding curve. And if you think about it, it's a really novel concept that hasn't existed in that sense before. So I have like just a few slides just conceptually to run you guys through, especially if we talk about the parameters. And maybe specifically if we think about like uses of, if we think about the uses of bonding curves, so can you guys all see my screen? Cool. So where we are using bonding curves, and this was based and curation markets, and this was based on an article I think I wrote in August around like using bonding curves in practice for curating intellectual property. And kind of so what you see here is kind of these are like pictures from like management consulting books around how new ideas get developed within a company. And this is so in general like taking an idea to market. You have ideas, you define the project, concept development, and then at the end, you normally launch one or two products actually out of this whole funnel. And how we are using this, so in drug development, so within the pharmaceutical industry, everything that drug companies essentially do is they create data about potential IP, about potential drugs that come to market. And essentially, so this whole curation markets pipeline, if you kind of think about this, so drug discovery moves through discovery, preclinical phases, clinical trials 1, 2, and 3, where a drug gets tested on human. So by the end here, the funnel is extremely small, but in the beginning, it's very, very big. And the problem that we're essentially trying to solve is that like, you have this huge funnel in the beginning, but then it's up to one company to produce the data and take it through all of those different stages. And so if you open that up to the market potentially, it could create a much better development model. So that's kind of for us framing how we use curation markets in that context. And the overarching concept then is like, what if you put that IP into a bonding curve? And so as you start thinking more about bonding curves generally, you realize that there's a lot of different things to twist and turn. And Thibaut actually wrote a really cool article recently on continuous organizations. I'm sure many of you have seen them. And for me, that was one of the first really cool articles as well that started thinking about what are some of the parameters that we can adjust, specifically around funding. And so a lot of people in the call, I think, in the questions that came in through, I think asked like different questions about how can we actually use this for funding, and does this make sense in any way, and what makes sense, what doesn't. And yeah, and so I think we can sorry, I skipped this one. So this is kind of like a little just conceptual diagram that I did for myself, but then I thought it looked kind of neat. And so I've started thinking in terms of what are the different parameters of bonding curves within like there's these 6 core things that we can essentially change about them. And so the first thing that you can kind of think of is like the issuance. Like what is the bonding curve actually issuing? Because it could you could have a bonding curve producing CryptoKitties, or like you could have a bonding curve that issues NFTs, or even something else. Like what comes out of it, which is most commonly in ERC20, but there's a lot of different designs to actually think about here. The other thing is the supply. So I think Simon, a lot of your early work was based on continuous token models. So essentially having an infinite supply of tokens. And for a lot of cool use cases, that can make sense. Like if we're trading a meme, under the assumption that memes are the future of communication, then should we really cap the total amount of meme coins that a specific meme can issue? So in that use case, that the fixing a supply makes sense. But if we think that like not fixing the supply makes sense. But if we think we want to sell, for example, in our case, we want to share shares in an intellectual property asset, that would need, you would kind of want a fixed amount of shares to be issued. Or maybe even you wouldn't. Like, it really depends. I think like fixing the supply versus not fixing the supply is a fundamental decision of what the asset should represent and how the market will eventually develop around it. Because if investors have, not investors, investors essentially, speculators in the market, if they have an expectation of a certain total supply, that changes their behavior. And it also ultimately changes the usage of the asset. And again, even now combining, if you combine an infinite supply with infinitely divisible tokens, that's a different thing. But you could have a finite supply and an ERC20 token, which is infinitely divisible. So you still have infinite shares in it, but you could have a finite supply and a non-fungible token. So really, depending on what your bonding curve is supposed to do, you can really start defining different parameters. The next one is the collateral that you put in. So at the Status Hackathon recently, we built an implementation. We realized that if you want the bonding curve to represent a certain asset, you probably want it to be somewhat stable. And most implementations with bonding curves today kind of stake in ETH. And so now you're staking the collateral that backs the contract is if the collateral that backs the contract is volatile and the trading of the curve is pretty volatile, then you're ending up with a super volatile situation, which might not be very useful. Or it might just create a lot of arbitrage between people who are just arbitraging between the value of ETH and the curve. So it creates inefficiency. So the first thing that we thought of is like having a curve that is backed by a stable coin would be more useful. And it's not that hard to build. Other projects are like you could stake in ETH, you could stake in other ERCs. And another really cool concept that we've been thinking about is like you can stake in other bonded tokens. And Slavas first wrote about this, I think beginning of this year, as like a side footnote of his article. It basically means like you take the bonded token and you stake that into another bonding curve. And the market application that we're thinking of using this for. So let's say you have penicillin, for example, as an antibiotic drug. And now, what if I create a derivative of that drug, which very often happens in the pharmaceutical industry? Let's say you have this lead compound, and then you develop a derivative that can have better features. How do you reward the original IP creators the investors in the first drug that are now, where some of the value is now flowing over into that second bonding curve market? Another example could be if I have a meme, and now that meme kind of adapts and it turns into a much better meme than the original meme was. And like, so how do you define that relationship between these two markets? So I think nested bonding curves are super interesting. And now we're still here. So now if we think about the asset that you stake in, so most bonding curves at the moment are not thinking about, or haven't like actually staked in real assets. So often it's like, if you look at meme lords, for example, it's essentially like an IPFS link that you would link to the bonding curve. But you could set the owner address of an NFT as a bonding curve. And that's, for example, what Billy Rennekamp, I think also first proposed around the beginning of this year. And it's kind of the basic of what we're doing is we first turn an IP asset into an NFT, and then the NFT is staked into a bonding curve. Another way of putting it is basically just trading shares in a CryptoKitty. So you could have a bonding curve market for a CryptoKitty. Then the next one is the function. I think this is one of the hardest things to really figure out and get right. And the function is basically, what does the curve of the market actually look like? And there's a whole range of different functions that you can look at: exponential functions, sigmoid functions, linear functions. And with each of those functions, you should ideally kind of evaluate what it actually means for the market, how it influences the trading behavior in it. And then the last one is pricing. And I think the pricing one is one where you can actually start doing a lot around funding mechanisms. And it's kind of where most of the research around funding is going into. Basically, how do you price buying in and buying out of the curve? And is it actually the same? And then around this, you can, there's kind of models that are similar to auctions that have been floating around actually selling again. So where do you put your sell price? Someone from Ocean, what was it? Fang, I think. Simon, you... Yeah,
Fang,
so something about what was it called? Equilibrium bonding curves, where you buy in at a certain price, but then you already set a sell price, and that changes the market dynamic of how the token is later on sold. Yeah, and there's a whole range of other pricing mechanisms that different people are exploring. Yeah, and so I think like so this is something that I've been working on, is like how can you actually map out the design space here? And I think it's something really, really interesting. And if anyone like that is on a call today wants to work on like mapping this out more, like feel free to hit me up. I think and I just want to look at the time quickly. How are we doing on time? Okay.
Well, it's nearly time. So.
Okay, nearly time. Cool. Sorry, my computer's just frozen. Okay. Maybe just because specific people asked about funding mechanisms, one of the ones that I commonly look at, so I'm just jumping through it, is so if an original curve creator sets himself an initial stake in the market, he can have a continuous funding mechanism by diluting himself further. So if I, for example, if I have a fixed amount of tokens and I set myself that I own the first 10% that ever get created, for example, by staking in an asset that I currently own. Let's say I put in a CryptoKitty into the market and I'm like, I want to have 10% of the token still of that CryptoKitty, assuming that more people will buy in. So once more people buy in, I can now sell my tokens back to the curve and get out money. Super simple. So it's just dilution. Another one is discounting curves, where, so this was recently proposed by Wilson Lau. Here's his link to his Medium article. I can post it in the group later if you haven't seen it yet. Discounting curve basically means that once you reach a certain funding goal, you almost like move to a lower curve and take a chunk out of the bonding curve. So you take a chunk out of the reserve. How that would have to be decided, I think is a difficult one to still figure out. I think with a lot of these funding mechanisms, as soon as you have a different price in and price out, or start changing the curve, I think governance becomes a huge topic. And it's what a lot of people, I think, are more and more saying, like, if you make any changes to the curve, it'll cause big governance discussions, I think. And how do you figure out the coordination of that governance? Another one is that you get staking returns from the curve. A very simple way to put this is, for example, if you have 10,000 ETH that is staked into a curve, and now the ETH is kind of just sitting there. So what if you took that ETH that is just sitting in the contract and you stake it to earn rewards in something like proof of stake? Or what if you loaned that ETH out? Creates a lot of further questions, but I think that's a really big one still to figure out with bonding curves anyway, is like, if we tie up so much collateral in a curve, like that collateral is just sitting there doing nothing. And in the real world, if it was actually dollars, that would be earning a negative return. So if we set up bonding curve markets for multiple years and we have this collateral just sitting there, how do we put that to use? Because if it's not, then it's essentially almost inefficiently allocated capital, but it also protects all of the investors in it. So I think that's a question. Then the common ones that are proposed, for example, by Thibault and continuous organization, is having a different price in price and price out price. So you buy in, but when you buy out, you lose 5% already because the buyout curve is lower, and that tax that is raised could then go to someone else. Wilson calls this like double curves. And one additional mechanism that you could also do is you could raise a tax directly on when someone buys in, and you have the same price in, price out price, but you raise a tax on every collateral that gets sent to the contract. That might leave the contract somewhat might leave it under collateralized. That's something that we built a very simple implementation on also for that the hackathon. Cool. I want to leave it there and like maybe just open up the floor to anyone who wants to. Wait, I'm just going to close this. How do I stop sharing? Yeah, if you guys want to jump in with anything that you want to discuss, you can either ask questions in the thing, or you can also like maybe feel free to unmute your mic.
Paul, there's a question from Chris on what happens in scenarios when there's duplicate markets for the same asset.
Yeah. Okay. I can explain it from from my lens specifically. So what we do is essentially to get any market. Okay. So let's say let's generalize it. So what we do is we have, before you put a market live, you have it approved by like a set of verifiers. So that would prevent the market from being, or that would prevent the protocol from being spammed. If you want to keep it extremely open, it will actually be very hard to prevent someone almost like front running you as soon as they see you posting a dank meme. And then what if someone just copies that meme and posts it on it as well? I think, yeah. It's quite hard. Specifically in our case, we're dealing with IP. So that IP, first of all, you need to verify, does that person actually have a patent? And yeah. Chris, do you maybe want to specify, do you mean in general around, like, for example, if we had the same memes that someone made?
Sure, yeah, it could be the same memes, or even thinking of it in terms of like for any type of artist. Like I could imagine a lot of markets emerging to sort of incentivize artists to begin using bonding curves to sort of fund their art. Like the fans sort of create it before the artist starts adopting it. So how do you then transition that to when the artist joins and sort of opts in?
Yeah. I mean, I guess what you could do is like as soon as. So what I would do in this case, I would, like, if you can create an NFT for the artwork, where first you have this kind of singular ownership, and then there's like immutable proof in a way. I mean, if super simplified, if you then attach it to like if you attach it with an IPFS link, and then you have immutable proof of that artwork was created. And then you move that NFT into a token bonding curve. You've baked in some steps that would prevent anyone saying, but look, this, for example, this bonding curve doesn't actually own any NFT. And so it's not like, it's like a fake market. That would be one way to think about it. I don't know, Simon, if you have any.
I think in some senses it might actually be valuable to have duplicate markets, but I think it really depends on the kind of what the token is supposed to represent. In some circumstances, you do want competition. You know, the token might represent the same thing, but it might have slight differences in how it wants to accomplish it. Maybe a slightly different curve or something like that. And then competition and duplication is a good thing, because then the market will sort of determine which one is the better winner year, like what's the better focal point to coordinate or congregate around. Yeah. But for some, you don't want duplicate markets. So it's an interesting question.
I would add, I guess, just that you could have a registry for the market, so an associated NFT, and then a registry for, I guess, if it was the kind of thing that you didn't want duplicated effort, you didn't want duplicated markets because this has some purpose like signaling. And if the signal gets blurred along several markets, it becomes a little bit less of a true signal, I guess, in that sense. So that is one thing I looked at for a previous project. And then you could even choose as the user which registry you actually recognize. So this company could have its own registry of what NFT markets it's recognizing, but that itself could also be open.
Awesome. Yeah. Interesting question. Or I guess range of solutions as well. Thanks.
If someone wants, I can still, because people are just posting questions. Just a question from Larry: how many types of functions are there? I think it, like, whatever makes sense for the market that you're creating. I mean, there's an infinity of mathematical combinations that you could plot in like a supply curve. I also think with a lot of these things, the like supply curve, like microeconomics and supply and demand economics have been around for like a very long time. And so I also think with some of these things, we shouldn't like don't reinvent the wheel kind of on like basic economics. But with regards to functions, I think we're only really beginning to even experiment or model what taking a function and modeling market behavior after that function could look like. I also think what people are going to realize is like maybe having a bonding curve for the entire market, like one function to govern them all is maybe not the best thing. So like we've been thinking around like how can you make staggered bonding curves almost, where like after a certain, like maybe like a period of this initial discovery, like maybe the curve stops and you like redefine the market, or it even becomes a freely floated token, where then the bonding curve actually like is for that initial discovery stage. I feel, yeah.
So just to add to that, I think in most circumstances, I think it just matters that there is a curve at all. Like it's not, it's just, it should just be monotonically increasing. Like the next person needs to pay more. It's like startup equity in a way. Like who figured out that the traditional way to give startup equity is the 4-year cliff, or the 4 years, like 1 year cliff, and then you stagger the rest. Like that is something that all startups kind of go like, this seems like what everyone else is doing, so this kind of makes sense. But is that the best way to distribute equity to your employees based on that frequency? How many people have questioned that, So, but it's just that employees care about they just care that there's equity. That's all. Like if it's just distributed in some sense over the next 4 or 5 years, then I'm happy. It doesn't need to be in a certain sense,
Yeah, it's that kind of giving an initial market to start with. It makes can create entirely different incentives already. I think like we need much more experimentation. So I really hope like we'll get a working. I mean, Slavas and his team at Berlin did a great job at like building meme lords, for example. I think it's really, really cool, and I hope to see more experimentation. But like, yeah, if we can move this space forward in a playful way as well, that is, I think, going to be extremely helpful. Yeah, if you haven't already, Simon just posted the link to meme lords. It's really cool. I'm just gonna pick like just 1 or 2 more questions from you guys. Achille, I think Achille previously asked this. How do you plan to attach the IP ownership to the NFT ownership? So what the NFT ownership for us essentially means is like the original IP creator relinquishes ownership of the IP. He basically says it would be like an artist saying, I created this artwork, but I don't want to own it anymore. It should be owned by everyone. And thus by virtue, like let's create this market for it. How this could work in practice is you would need to sign some kind of legal contract that the IP is now being owned by this other entity. The way that we're looking at it is you move the IP into a trust. And a trust is a common legal structure to relinquish ownership of something. It's like I'm moving my house into a trust so that it can be owned by my kids at some stage. So that legal mechanism exists. And then the next step, the trust, which is just a legal contract, would have to issue another legal contract that now says, our assets are now being owned by this protocol or like by this smart contract. But in theory, that is not as different as a trust saying our assets are being traded by by some trading software. Yeah, so that's one way that we're rethinking about the legal complexities of this. Someone else had a legal question, which was, if people are buying IP and expecting to profit from the drug, would the bonding curve be minting a security and only be available to accredited investors? So if you think about, again, so where I would put this question is, remember I presented those 6 parameters? That is a question in principle about the asset. So if we say, for example, we're trading a house, like I'm putting the deed to my house in this bonding curve and anyone can buy a share in the house, that would be a security. But in this sense, these are not traditional securities from the sense of like having accredited investors buy them. I think with regards to IP investments are a very different thing than, for example, purchasing a security. So you don't get into that territory of needing accredited investors. For example, you can buy a patent. Anyone can buy a patent. You don't need to be an accredited investor to do so. but it is a sense of securitization from a legal perspective, because you are taking an asset and you're selling shares in that asset. And for example, if an artist selling his work, that would also be intellectual property. That could also essentially be a securitization of that property. Because if now that artist work ever gets like replicated and you actually own, and you might be then entitled to royalty payments of the use of that work. And so as soon as you're entitled to royalties, you get into like securities kind of territory. Simon, do you want to add? But I'm not like, I think Simon does it right. He says, I'm not a lawyer. But those are, but those are some of the thoughts.
Compliant.
Yeah, those are some of the thoughts that
but
I have had.
It is, yeah. I think, you know, one of some of the earlier designs was just to say that, you know, how can we make organizations easier without necessarily resorting to having to appeal to some authority to make this happen, like to incorporate, to get equity, to get limited liability, and all these things require processes, and in many circumstances been made substantially easier. But now we can make things that sort of not circumvent them, but just provides different options for doing somewhat of the same things. You know, in the previous world, Dogecoin might have had to incorporate and actually make a company to issue a coupon or a loyalty token or whatever. So it was just also questions about how can we make organizations more effective. But yeah, I think it until some of these designs become a big thing, no one's really going to pay attention at this stage, I feel. So, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't like do your due diligence.
I just wanted to ask maybe, just because also like we're running to the hour. Luke just asked, like, do you guys want to go on a little bit and like keep chatting, or what's the general sentiment? I'm happy to stay for a little bit longer, but yeah, I mean, whoever.
For now, and then anyone who likes to stay on can stay on with you and take some final questions. How does that sound?
Okay, there's also a little voting type thing in the if you go to the participants, you can say yes, no. So if you want to stay, just say yes. Otherwise, we'll just say a few words. Close up.
Cool. Maybe I'll read one question from Luke. So Luke is asking, is that Luke Duncan, by the way, from Aragon? Oh, cool. Hey, Luke. So Luke is asking, if the price is increasing in the curve, then the curve will naturally transition out of using the curve and instead use traditional markets. So the price could only, I think, transition either. One way I would think of is like the price might find a natural equilibrium, whereas people don't think it's in a, let's say you have an infinite curve, an infinite linear curve. There, the price would probably find an equilibrium at some point, and then either the asset becomes, let's say the popularity of the asset stays exactly at that point, and then probably people would trade tokens either on secondary markets, or because then it would probably be more efficient than trading directly with the curve, because anyone who would want to sell would get slippage by selling to the curve. Slippage basically means that if you sell a big chunk into a market, you lose some part of the capital just because the price adjusts along that. What I think would happen is, so let's say you use a token money curve only for the initial discovery, like a discovery phase of an asset. And so you would, for example, say, this market has 10 million tokens and it can have a total market cap of 10 million. So the final price of the last token sold could be $1. And then what would happen is, and after that, the last token is issued, and now basically all of the tokens have been issued, and then you would have trading on secondary exchanges or secondary markets. So then on the secondary market, the price of the token might actually increase to $2 or $3 or $4. But now you've had this very slow not funding mechanism, but price discovery mechanism of that asset. And if the asset should ever become worthless, like maybe no one uses this meme anymore, then everyone could sell back into the curve. So the capital that is still in the curve can be allocated into the market again. Yeah, I had a discussion with Amin and another developer from the Spank chain, because they were thinking of like having ICOs for individual performers. And so I told them like it would be interesting to use Curation Markets or token monikers to buy coins in performers, because you would now see like those performers rise, but eventually maybe one of the performers decides to leave the industry or like retire, and then that capital that went into the performer once could come out again and actually be allocated elsewhere. Yeah. Trying to think. Luke, do you maybe want to just, I see you're asking questions, but there's so many other comments. Do you want to quickly, did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, that's good. It's fine.
All right. Well, I guess maybe that's a good time to close up. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. We heard a little bit from Simon about what the history of Curation Markets was and what it might look like going into the future. And then Paul expanded on bonding curves specifically. And there were some really great questions. Thank you all for your participation. The next call will be on the 5th of December, and Devin will be sending out a calendar invite for that. And if you'd like to present or moderate the next discussion, please send her a message directly. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys, for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.